Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk tonight. I'm delighted to be here and talk about the Idler. So, and you'll have to forgive me, I've kind of got two screens going on if I'm back and forth as well. So tonight I'm going to introduce the Idler for those of you who are unfamiliar with that magazine and the work that Conan Doyle published within it. One of the significant aspects of the Idler was that it was an illustrated magazine. So I want to think a bit about how we might read Conan Doyle's work in its illustrated periodical context, something that I think I saw Jonathan Cranfield's here tonight. He's done this very much with the Strand magazine already in a fabulous book. So once I've set the scene, I'll move to discuss some of the stories that he wrote for the Idler and their relation to his presentation of himself in two non-fiction articles published in the magazine. I'll argue that in these illustrated pieces, Conan Doyle explores authority and expertise, and that they suggest the kind of expert that Conan Doyle could be perceived to be by readers of the Idler. Okay, the problem with this is that my screen isn't changing. There we go, sorry, there we are. Right, there we go. So, at the time that Conan Doyle was writing in the Idler, he was enormously famous, of course. Andrew Lycett's biography reveals that Conan Doyle had achieved celebrity status by 1892 and was receiving sackfuls of fan mail. This was the year that the Idler began publishing his work. Interest in him warranted interviews. One appeared in the Bookman in May 1892, and in July 1892, the Strand magazine, the magazine which you'll probably be familiar with as having published the Sherlock Holmes stories, they published an interview with him in which he revealed that people wrote to him suggesting plots for Holmes and letting him know if they had guessed the solution to the story. And the same article gives a tour of his South Norwood home, a sign of the extent of the interest in him. And given his enduring celebrity and that of Sherlock Holmes, it's little surprise that today we know much about Conan Doyle and the Strand magazine, but less is known about the Idler or his stories that were published in it. The Idler, an illustrated monthly magazine, first appeared in February 1892 under the editorship of Jerome K. Jerome and Robert Barr. It was announced with some fanfare. The Review of Reviews described it as a formidable rival for the Strand magazine. Certainly, it took a similar miscellaneous form to the Strand, featuring a variety of serial and single-issue stories, poetry, photography, memoir, and other non-fiction forms. And I'm conscious the audience is very mixed tonight, and I know some of you engage closely with periodicals, but for those of you who haven't, I wanted to talk for a minute about reading the Idler. So I read it first online as part of the ProQuest British periodicals collection. Now this is behind a paywall, but if you have access through a library that subscribes, I'd certainly recommend that you read Conan Doyle's work there. It'll give you a sense of how his original readers would at least have seen it. However, when I was searching an online database, I felt a bit like the magazine's been taken apart and it extracts single articles as you respond to your as it responds to your search. So it doesn't quite give you an authentic reading experience. As someone who's interested in how the materiality of a text might contribute to our reading experience, I felt that something was still missing. Reading online didn't give me a sense of the scale or the materiality of reading a 19th century periodical, or what it was like to flick through the pages. I was lucky enough to be able to get hold of some of the earlier volumes of the Idler, so this is what it looks like, the size of it, you can see. It's smaller than we might think of as a magazine today, and because I'm looking at it, the issues bound into volumes, I don't know what the covers of the individual numbers would have been like, so I can't compare it to the cover of the famous Strand. But you can see how the work was laid out and think about how the readers might have engaged with the magazine. These are the first few pages of the first issue. This is very representative of how the text is laid out across the magazine, the different styles of illustration and the ways in which the images mingle with the text. The Review of Reviews identified the main draw of the first number of the Idler as the new serial by Mark Twain called The American Claimant, which is what you can see here on the slide. And there was an interview with the author. But that first issue also featured work by popular writers Bret Harte, Andrew Lang, and Jerome K. Jerome himself. Published circulation figures suggest its popularity. Sales of its first issue have been put at 200,000, and between 1895 and 97, 100,000 copies were apparently produced per month. Its popularity can also be seen in its persistence. It was published until 1911, albeit with slight changes to its title and with changes to its editorship. The Idler was comfortable with being seen to meet mass market demand and popularity. Indeed, Laura Casson-Fiss has explored a regular column in the magazine in which its contributors, and she says, treated the notion of exclusivity itself as a joke. The serial column was known as the Idlers Club. Casson-Fiss's study of it contrasts what one might associate with a popular magazine with the connotations of the club. She explains that the magazine readership is commonly associated with mass consumerism, commercial transaction, and anonymous global distribution, whereas the club suggests a cozy friendship among select members that excludes everyone else. So in this column, different ideas and opinions were brought together, moving between a variety of named contributors to each column. She finds the tone of the club column to foster a relaxed atmosphere in which the reader has some intimacy with literary celebrities. She says it imitated club talk, to use her words. So it's less a dialogue, more light-hearted listening, light-hearted talking without listening, rather. Thus, the column created what she calls an intimate, imagined space for its mass readership. Although Conan Doyle did not contribute to the column, if we're to read it as Casson-Fiss suggests, as what she calls a microcosm of the journal as a whole, then his contributions to the Idler's imagined space are inflected with an intimacy at odds with any expected distance between the authority of the writer and their audience. In other words, reading Conan Doyle in the context of the Idler with its cozy club atmosphere has the potential to make the reader feel close to the author, rather than experience the distance predicated on his authority. In this context, his writing in the Idler positions readers where they can consider authority and what it means to be on the brink of the unknown and how knowledge is created. Conan Doyle's writing encourages his reader to challenge appearances of authority and to recognize instead the significance of expertise with its dependence on experience and effort. And it's worth saying Casson-Fiss has just produced a new monograph on the Idler talking about humour within it, and I'm really excited to get my hands on it. I haven't been able to read it yet, but there is more to come if you're interested in this periodical. So what did Conan Doyle write to encourage this thinking? Well, he contributed a variety of work to the magazine. The first piece was a short story called De Profundis, which appeared in the second issue in March 1892. In chronological order, this was followed by the non-fiction, The Glamour of the Arctic, and the humorous tale, The Los Amigos Fiasco. That was in July and then December of the same year. In 1893, it saw the publication of his autobiographical account. That was My First Book, Juvenilia. And then three very different stories appeared in 1894. The really gruesome, The Case of Lady Sannox, which was in January. Then there was The Romantic Sweethearts, so very different. That came in July. And then finally, The Doctors of Hoyland in July. 4 stories would later be collected in Round the Red Lamp, which you may have heard of or read in other collections. Those stories were The Los Amigos Fiasco, The Case of Lady Sannox, The Doctors of Hoyland and Sweethearts. If you haven't come across Round the Red Lamp before, it was a collection of stories ostensibly related to medicine. The red lamp was a symbol of medical practice, although one that had become caught up in discussions of quackery, a symbol not necessarily to be trusted. It was associated with questions of authority and expertise. All the stories from the Idler that later appeared in Round the Red Lamp consider in some way or another what it means to be an expert and who has authority conferred upon them. Medicine also appeared in the serial The Stark Monroe Letters, which were contributed to the Idler between 1894 and 95. The 2 non-fiction pieces also explore expertise and authority. They both draw on Conan Doyle's experience. In 1880, he paused his medical studies to work as a surgeon on board the Arctic whaling ship Hope. There he experienced an adventure that he'd later describe in his autobiography as a strange and fascinating chapter of his life. 12 years after the voyage, Glamour of the Arctic, wove together scenes of life on a whaling ship and the whales that they hunted. Juvenilia was Conan Doyle's contribution to a series called My First Book. It was a series devoted to writers and their writing experiences. Walter Besant had produced the first article for this series, and other contributors included Grant Allen, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and Rudyard Kipling. This range of popular authors again demonstrates what a treasure trove the Idler is. Conan Doyle's piece details his development as a writer. As you can probably imagine from the pages that I've shown so far, Conan Doyle's work in The Idler was accompanied by illustrations. And before we look at them more closely, it's worth thinking about how these illustrations contribute to our reading. A range of scholarship suggests how we might read 19th century illustrated texts. Robert L. Patton explains that illustrations are not mimetic. They're not the text pictured. To say then that an illustrator illustrates a text might mean that the artist enlightens the text. In other words, they enhance our understanding of the narrative rather than merely represent it. Stuart Sillars explains how technological developments in print created a unified discourse of word and image, thus suggesting we read an illustrated text as a whole, all parts contributing to the meaning created. And Julia Thomas's study, Pictorial Victorians, has demonstrated the significance of reading these texts as a unified discourse. She finds that meanings are generated in the very interaction between the textual and the visual, the points at which they coincide and conflict. So what I'm interested in this evening then, as we look at these pieces, is the ways in which the illustrations work with the verbal text to make meaning, how we read the words and images together. We're not just thinking about Conan Doyle's words then, but his words working with the illustrations. And that's what I think is exciting about reading an author's work in its original publishing context. We can access the meaning created in these works as their first readers might have done. In so doing, it's impossible to look at all the stories in this talk. So I'm going to look at two examples which clearly contribute to Conan Doyle's presentation of authority and expertise and bring them into conversation with the two non-fiction pieces. De Profundis at first seems to be a straightforward tale that suggests the folly of resisting professional help. The story features John Van Sittart and his wife, and it's narrated by his agent. The couple are due to sail to Colombo when Van Sittart becomes ill. When he first announces he's unwell, the narrator tells Van Sittart that a touch of the sea will see you right, and he responds, "I want no other doctor." Van Sittart's behaviour and appearance suggests that he's drunk. And indeed, the narrator convinces himself of this, stating, "It's sad to see so noble a young man in the grip of the most bestial of all the devils." Yet we soon discover the narrator's misdiagnosis. Van Sittart has not had a drain for 2 days. Van Sittart himself diagnoses London to be the cause and proposes being at sea to be the cure. The accompanying illustration that you can see here appears hasty. It suggests a lack of attention to the misdiagnosis, and certainly Van Sittart himself in the black jacket here with his darkened eyes and only partially present is difficult to read. The narrator attempts to persuade Van Sittart to see a medical doctor, but he refuses, preferring to trust the presence of the ship's surgeon to ensure his safe journey. Once aboard, Van Sittart's illness is diagnosed as smallpox, and his subsequent death at sea implies the folly of self-diagnosis. Conan Doyle demonstrates the confident ease with which a layman can mistakenly interpret the evidence and the dangers of refusing to engage with the experts. However, the story's conclusion complicates this. Anticipating the conclusion, the narrator's introduction imagines a mother seeing, so to speak, her dying son from a distance. She's not there. And he states, "Far be it from me to see that there lies no such power within us." The power, in other words, to experience the death of someone from a distance. He acknowledges the possibility of the supernatural here, but firmly encourages skepticism. "Once at least I have known that which was within the laws of nature to seem to be far upon the further side of them." The conclusion of Van Sittart's story illustrates that point. The significance of the title is that the body of Van Sittart rises out of the depths in what appears at first to be a vision. The narrator and Vansittart's wife are sailing to Madeira, thinking they'll be able to meet up with and nurse the sick man there, when his body dramatically bursts out of the depths and then sinks back down again below. They are unaware that he's already died aboard the ship. So his wife believes she sees a vision signifying he has died at that very moment. When they catch up with the captain of Vansittardt's ship, they find in fact that he died 8 days previously and he has been buried at sea. So this knowledge changes the narrator's interpretation of what they've seen. He concludes it must have been Vansittardt's actual body. He knows now that the vision appeared at the exact place of burial. The surgeon says the weight tying down the body was not well attached, and the noises that they heard could be explained by the presence of sharks. Nonetheless, he explains a clearer case of a wraith has seldom been made out, and since then it has been told as such and put into print as such and endorsed as such by a learned society. So in the case of Vansittardt's illness, the narrator and Vansittardt's misdiagnosis suggests a need to rely on expert intervention. But in the case of Vansittardt's death, the narrator's very plausible explanation drawing on the surgeon's expert evidence contradicts that of other experts. What De Profundis does then is at once emphasize the need for informed interpretation, but reminds the reader that experts may interpret differently, that they are competing narratives to navigate in order to understand the world. The Glamour of the Arctic is very much concerned with navigating competing interpretations and narratives. As I've already explained, in 1880, Conan Doyle took a break from his medical studies and was employed as a surgeon on board Hope, the Arctic whaling ship. This piece clearly draws on that experience. And it's possible that readers would have known at least that he'd been on an Arctic voyage. It's mentioned in both the interview in the Bookman and in the Strand. Given his own Arctic adventure, one might imagine the Glamour of the Arctic would employ an authoritative tone, with Conan Doyle as an experienced guide. Yet he shifts between genres, layering one upon the other. This isn't just an autobiographical sketch or a travel guide, there's history, natural history, adventure. Thus, the Glamour of the Arctic gives a sense of authorial uncertainty, of his purpose not quite being clear, of him being quite caught up in the glamour of the voyage. Such a narrative envelops the audience in a haze. To return to how Conan Doyle presents himself then, we can start by considering how he positions himself amongst the crew. I love this photograph. It comes towards the end of the piece. To view it properly, you have to stop. So you have to turn the page on its side. The layout of the article, the size of the pages and the printing all result in the reader having to actually pause over this image. Turning the page slows us down, and slowed we really look. The image gains importance if we interact with it like this. Now the photograph is titled Deck of a Whaler. As such, it seems generic. This could be any crew. At the same time, I can't help wanting this blurry man to be Doyle. It looks so very much like him. I haven't been able to trace where these photographs come from, so I can't be sure. If it is Conan Doyle, then he's presented here as just another one of the crew. He's dressed similarly to the others. The only thing distinguishing him is his lack of involvement in the scrubbing of the deck. He has no broom. He's the same, but not quite. Indeed, in relating his experience, Conan Doyle fails to explain his actual position amongst the crew, and his reasons for the voyaging go unnamed. He provides no details of his work on board as a ship's surgeon. In neglecting these details, he can forego including his real expertise within the crew, something not associated with the Glamour of the Arctic. Certainly in Conan Doyle's text, the crew are the experts. Conan Doyle is the observer from the outset. His first paragraph sets out to describe whaler fishers, and within it of himself, he says, "I have seen and spoken with many an old whaling man." His authority to present whalers and their prey comes from this personal knowledge. He reports the tales of the whalers. He notes that singular incidents occur in these northern waters and that there are a few old whalers who have not their queer yarn. His inclusion of their anecdotes and tall tales only adds to this hazy glamour with which the text veils the Arctic. But it's not just an expertise gained through anecdotes or others. He has experienced what they experience. He's not simply watching and listening, he's been overtaken by it all. He writes, "But if a man have the good fortune to be present at the fall, and above all, if he be, as I have been, in the harpooning and in the lancing boat, he has the taste for sport which it would be ill to match. To play a game of salmon is a royal game, but when your fish weighs more than a suburban villa and is worth a clear £2,000, when too your line is a thumb's thickness of manila rope with 50 pounds, every strand tested for 36 pounds, it dwarfs all other experiences. This is luck that excites all the senses. It's on a huge scale and it overshadows all that has come before. It's left him almost breathless. Look how the description runs on. Conan Doyle presents himself as entirely involved, consumed. He presents himself as an expert, not in any dry, bookish way, but as someone who has the ability to bring the reader into the excitement. This is not just his experience, it's your fish, your line. Conan Doyle does not just portray himself as having experienced the whalers, he also describes the whale itself, again from experience. The whale has a small eye, little larger than a bullock, but I cannot easily forget the mute expostulation which I read in one, as it dimmed over in death within hand's touch of me. There's a lot going on in this sentence. Conan Doyle presents himself as close enough to provide a comparative description of the size of the eye, first of all. He has proximity. Thus it appears that when he saw, what he saw was firmly embedded in his memory. So his recollection has a strength to it. And he interprets the expression of an animal without wavering or uncertainty, a skilled interpreter. In these two descriptions, then, we have Conan Doyle physically consumed by a close-up experience he can easily interpret, and he draws you into it. There's a confidence in this. He's encouraging his readers to rely on him. These passages are accompanied by this illustration of the whale being hunted. The whale dominates the picture, the harpoon boat far smaller in the distance. This focuses the reader on the whale, on its power as it churns up the sea. It contributes to a sense of Conan Doyle's bravery, to the impression we get of him. Not a whaler, but prepared to confront this creature capable of violence that dwarfs those chasing it. Reading the text alone, the focus is the overwhelming excitement, and the whale seems weak as Conan Doyle reads its eye. So the illustration contributes a new aspect to our own interpretation of the author, courage in the face of power and danger. Nonetheless, in spite of his bravery, confidence, and proximity, Conan Doyle suggests in his concluding paragraph that in writing The Glamour of the Arctic, he has been dazzled. He states, "There is a good deal with which I had meant to say, as if he's been somehow distracted from his purpose." He at once destabilizes his own authority to relate the things that throw the glamour over the Arctic, as he also acknowledges that these missing utterances have all been said much better already. Nonetheless, his final move to present himself as innovative in writing on the region, and he does so in such a way that draws on an area in which he was known to hold expertise. He attends to the medical and curative side of the Arctic. The haze seems to lift. Davos Platz has shown what cold can do in consumption, and in the life-giving air of the Arctic Circle, no noxious germ can live. Straightforward and with clarity, Conan Doyle presents what he terms a safe prophecy. Before many years are past, steam yachts will turn to the north every summer with a cargo of the weak-chested, and people will understand that nature's icehouse is a more healthy place than her vapor bath. It seems an ideal grounded scientifically in the Arctic air, not in its enchanted glamour. But Conan Doyle's words are not the end of the narrative. Rather, Webb's final illustration brings us back to both the whale and the seaman with whom Conan Doyle was so much in awe. This illustration differs from Webb's other images, where they reflected the Arctic through a haze of soft washes. Here, Webb hatches lines. There's no haze in his visual representation of his ideal end, only entirely clear lines. And so both Conan Doyle and Webb conclude with a clarity emerging from the haze of the rest of the piece. However, Webb seems utterly at odds with Conan Doyle. In bringing us back to the whale and its potential for devastation, you can see that there, his illustration seems to mock Conan Doyle's idealization of the medical benefits of an Arctic voyage, where these devastating, dangerous creatures lie beneath the surface. The begging seaman, apparently injured by the whale, smiles nonetheless, perhaps encouraging us not to pity him, but to laugh at Conan Doyle's proposition, given the danger. And yet, the seaman's illustration of his disaster recalls Conan Doyle's earlier description of harpooning the whale. There, he wrote, "Did the whale cast its tail in the air after the time-honoured fashion of the pictures, that boat would be in evil case, but fortunately, when frightened or hurt, it does no such thing, but curls its tail up beneath it like a cowed dog and sinks like a stone." Now, if that's the case, then the seaman's picture of the potential danger of the whales seems to be pure imagination. The final image then, when considered in light of Conan Doyle's description and against the other illustrations, suggests that Conan Doyle's authority in prophesying the popularity of the Arctic as a future medical cure is mistaken, but rather that the potential dangers are nothing but fiction. Conan Doyle's prophecy of curative voyages should not then be dismissed. Overall, this article portrays his authority to speak on the Arctic as well-grounded and above mockery. In The Idler, however, the conclusion of the Arctic is not, of the glamour of the Arctic rather, is not the end. This is one of the great things about having the whole issue available. The discussion of the Arctic is returned to in the Idlers Club column in the issue. And this serves to contrast Conan Doyle's expertise and the authority with that of others. So 3 experts put forth their opinions on Conan Doyle's proposal of repeated voyages to find the passage to the pole. That proposal is one of the other main points of the Glamour of the Arctic. The respondents are a whaling captain, Clement Markham, and Rear Admiral Markham. These experts have differing opinions, but there's little of the glamour Conan Doyle has created to their account. Their differences leave the reader listening to the club talk, still with no one expert, and even with its straightforward expression, the discussion only adds to the haze. This does also contribute to constructing a particular impression of Conan Doyle. We know he's not an expert in the same way as a captain or rear admiral, but his ideas about Arctic exploration are taken seriously enough for them to respond, in print and at some length. This leaves an impression of Conan Doyle being well respected as someone who can learn from his experience. He can appear authoritative in more than just his storytelling. Where Glamour and indeed De Profundis explore the difficulties of untangling competing expert and imaginative interpretations of the possibilities of experience, Los Amigos contrasts expertise with unearned authority. It's certainly not a serious story. It concerns a failed attempt at execution by electrocution, which, far from killing the prisoner, seems to have made him invincible. This humorous tale positively encourages its readers to laugh at authority, in other words, to discount its appearance of power when it's unearned. Significant to Conan Doyle's purpose here are the aspects of the tale dealing with the refusal of those in authority to accept the opinion of an amateur expert. The narrator is a journalist, John Murphy Stonehouse, who, in the interest of financial rewards, sets out to tell the true facts about the case. Duncan Warner is condemned to be the first man to be executed via the powerful dynamos of Los Amigos, and the town council have appointed 4 experts to oversee proceedings. 3 of these experts appear to be considered so because of their professional success. The 4th, Peter Stupnagel, was regarded as a harmless crank who made science his hobby, who never published his results. Although Conan Doyle clearly implies his expertise, for, he writes, he was eternally working with wires and insulators and Leyden jars. In other words, he's continually gaining experience of that which he's about to later explain. Stupnagel sits quietly through the meeting where the group plan their execution, but as it draws to a close, he contradicts their decision to sextuple the charge from the strength previously used in New York. He states, Gentlemen, you appear to me to show an extraordinary ignorance on the subject of electricity. You have not mastered the first principles of its action upon any human being. He continues to question their assumption, asking, do you know anything by actual experiment of the effects of powerful shocks? Their pompous response sets up Conan Doyle's argument about what constitutes expertise. We know it by analogy, they say. In other words, they lack experience. In the face of this presumption, Stupnagel offers evidence about the effect of electricity on the human body, which is duly ignored, and the committee outvotes him. George Hutchison's illustrations on opposing pages that you can see here emphasize a distinction between the experience and arrogance. Stupnagel's bench is set out with all the equipment needed for experiment. The experts, on the other hand, are seated at a table where a whiskey bottle is central. Stupnagel focuses intently through his glasses at his work, actively manipulating the wires. The other men are presented as careless and inactive. One swings on his chair, one has his hands in his pockets, and one is slumped with his head on his hand. The illustration of the men is titled Burst Out Laughing, further emphasizing their arrogant disregard for Stupnagel's practical experience and knowledge. In Conan Doyle's text, the incredible failure of Warner's execution, rendering him apparently immortal, signifies that practical experience, in this case experiment, over authoritative position is the reliable source of information. As the story concludes, a marshal declares to Stupnagel, "You seem to be the only person who knows anything." Stupnagel's expert knowledge was what mattered, and not the elevated professional positions of the others, when that position was underpinned by ignorance. Conan Doyle suggests in this funny but otherwise slight story that expertise can be achieved by anyone committed to developing it, and that those with authority may have unwarranted confidence in their own ability to theorize. Thus, he provides his readers with a way to begin to untangle some of the competing narratives, like those depicted at the conclusion of De Profundis. Certainly, new knowledge must draw on an expertise gained by experience, not by theory alone. In my first book, Conan Doyle explores his own expertise and authority as a storyteller, finding the latter to lie in public relation with others. My first book presents Conan Doyle as an authoritative storyteller from a young age. The illustrator, Sidney Cowell, depicts the schoolboy Conan Doyle sitting on a desk, elevated, as the author puts it, whilst small boys gaze up at him, little boys all squatting on the floor. Both Cowell and Conan Doyle thus make a distinction that confers authority on the storyteller. Furthermore, we learn that his school friends were willing to pay for his work. I was bribed with pastry to continue these efforts, and I remembered that I always stipulated for tarts down and strict business, which shows that I was born to be a member of the Authors' Society. Of course, there's an intentional humour here, but nonetheless, in describing this public authoritative performance, Conan Doyle is constructing an image of a member of a profession. The article implies that authority and professionalism occur in public. In my first book, expertise is developed much more privately, however. That development is facilitated through reading. Conan Doyle's account describes the effect of reading as both conferring special knowledge and affording a visceral experience, whilst he presents himself as exceptional. This in turn suggests his expertise as a storyteller. First, he describes years reading unusually intensely, joking about a rumour that a special meeting of the library committee was held in his honour, at which a bylaw was passed that no subscriber should be permitted to change his book more than 3 times a day. And he continues to explain that he managed to enter his 10th year with a good deal in his head that he could never have learned in classrooms. Here then, Conan Doyle's presenting himself as a prodigious reader who has learnt more from his private reading than at school. As he continues his description of childhood reading, it has a dual effect of presenting the skill of writers and his own imaginative powers. He writes, "Your heart and soul are out in the prairies and oceans with your heroes. It is you who act and suffer and enjoy. It has all the more real than reality. Since those days, I have in very truth both shot bears and harpooned whales, but the performance was flat compared to the first time I did it with Mr. Ballantyne or Captain Mayne Reid at my elbow. Here he presents his empathetic and imaginative engagement with the texts of his childhood as more powerfully educative than formal schooling. At the same time, this is a collaboration with the authors at his side. As he shows how he knew the world through fiction, so he presents the expertise of authors as they create more excitement than the most thrilling real-life adventure. And in so doing, as a writer of adventure himself, he suggests his own skill. As we've just explored, only a few months earlier, the magazine included De Profundis, set at sea, and The Glamour of the Arctic. And then here, accompanying this praise of the power of adventure writing, is an illustration of a ship sailing in an icy sea. This creates a link for regular readers of The Idler between the powerful, evocative experience he had of reading adventure writers and his own writing. In spite of his successful schoolboy performances, Conan Doyle writes about his publication history as a struggle with rejection and persistence. 50 little cylinders of manuscript did I send out during 8 years, which described irregular orbits among publishers and usually came back like paper boomerangs to the place where they started from. He continues, my apprenticeship was a long and trying one. So here he suggests that he was learning his craft, and his humorous discussion of a lost manuscript reveals he clearly did not feel himself to be immediately an expert. He writes, of course it was the best thing I ever wrote. Whoever lost a manuscript wasn't. But I must in all honesty confess that my shock at its disappearance would be as nothing to my horror if it were to suddenly appear again in print. If one or two of my earlier efforts had also been lost in the post, my conscience would have been the lighter. His humour here is disarming. There's no arrogance with him. With his openness about his failures, Conan Doyle portrays himself as possessing humility, but his persistence and the use of the term apprenticeship suggests a levity accompanied by a determination and hard work. He may laugh, but no one could accuse him of not taking writing seriously. This is hard work. And considering hard work and writing, Conan Doyle's medical career is presented as intruding on his writing in this piece. Following the lost manuscript, he explains, I then started upon an exceedingly sensational novel, which interested me extremely at the time, though I've never heard that it had the same effect on anyone else afterwards. I may urge in extenuation of all shortcomings that it was written in the intervals of a busy, though ill-paying practice, and a man may try that and combine it with literary work before he knows quite what that means. When a visitor wants to see him as a doctor, it is announced with tidings of dismay. The visitor returns and bursts into the room. As Conan Doyle struggles to fix the narrative in his mind to return to it later, he feels towards the medical work that another morning has been wasted. He is an expert, a trained doctor, but he presents that work as giving him none of the joy that reading did. And in intruding into his writing, it is slowing his progress and development. We are left with a man well trained in one profession who's only too happy to undertake the frustrating work of developing the expertise to practice another. Although we have seen a focus on hard work and persistence from the outset, this piece suggests an inevitability to Conan Doyle's success as well. The article commences with the portrait of the author buttoned up in his jacket, tie at his throat, by George Hutchinson. And this is facing the first page of the narrative. You can see it there. The author's head is turned towards the text. Underneath is a facsimile of Conan Doyle's signature, yours very truly, A. Conan Doyle. It lends his account authority and adds to the impression of intimacy that we've seen the Idler fosters. Then on the first page of the narrative, facing in the opposite direction, is a smaller illustration, this time by Sidney Cowell. I was 6. The young Conan Doyle is depicted in the act of writing, and the author appears little different from his adult image. Similar dress, similar hair. Visually, there is a direct connection between the two, implying a connection between his childhood writing and his position as a popular author. So, I set out to explore Conan Doyle's work in The Idler, both to understand his and his illustrators' representations of authority and expertise, and to determine how that reflected on the author himself. I've tried to demonstrate how he constructed that here. I've highlighted Catherine Fiss's reading of the Idlers Club and how that inflects the whole of the magazine with a cozy, intimate atmosphere. I think this then creates a sense of the relationship between Conan Doyle and his readers as close. Now, we know he was frustrated with Sherlock Holmes. By April 1893, he was telling his mother of writing the final Holmes story to get rid of him. And that comes from the demands of his readership. But I think that these pieces in The Idler would have left his readers with an impression of closeness rather than frustration, an impression that Conan Doyle wanted to talk to them. The whole magazine has a humorous tone. And within the extracts I've selected, Conan Doyle employs such a tone too. This gives a lightheartedness to his writing that suggests an easy relationship with his readers. De Profundis highlights the way in which competing, apparently expert interpretations can be arrived at. The layman can be wrong, but will encounter very different experts. This is presented as a challenge, but one, if we consider the glamour of the Arctic, that he is equal to. He seems in the pages of The Idler to be constructing an image of himself as an expert author, one whose authority has been well earned by embracing experience, just like Stupnagel in that story. The confluence of the visual and the verbal in all the texts are an important part of how we can read Conan Doyle, contributing to our impression of him. This is an impression of one who reads very closely, who works very hard, but one who does not use that authority to create a distance from his reader. This is an impression that both suits The Idler, but is also enhanced by being created in this particular magazine. Thank you.
Thank you so much.